We found a body in a deep cave, in a layer of soil that predates glaciation. It looks like a 7-year-old child, but it's the body of an adult. There are no Neanderthal features. It could be a population like the Hobbit of Flores, isolated in a very dense forest as they were at that time. There may be several more bodies. It will take years of work. This is a direct quote attributed to French archaeologist Ludovic Slimak in early 2026, who is most famous for the discovery of the Taurine Neanderthal in southern France. That is the kind of statement that changes the temperature of a room. It is brief, almost casual, and yet it opens a door into one of the strangest possibilities in European prehistory. That somewhere in the deep cave systems of southern France, in a layer older than the Great Cold that reshaped the continent, there sits an adult human relative so small that it looked like a child, yet apparently lacked the anatomy we expect from the Neanderthal world. The deeper you look at that statement, the more unsettling it becomes, because Europe at that time is not supposed to contain a creature like this. Europe is supposed to contain powerful pre-Neanderthal populations, broad-bodied hunters adapted to cold, meat, stone, and endurance. It is not supposed to contain something with the proportions of a 7-year-old adult, hidden in a forested cave, suggesting a population that lived alongside the larger humans of the Middle Pleistocene and somehow left almost nothing behind. Anyway, the first thing to understand is that the phrase European Hobbit is not a diagnosis. It is a comparison. The Hobbit of Flores, properly known as Homo floresiensis, is the famous small-bodied human relative from the island of Flores in Indonesia, with a height of about 1 meter, a tiny brain, and a strange mixture of ancient and more advanced traits. It shocked the scientific world because it showed that a human lineage could become radically small and still make stone tools, survive in difficult terrain, and persist until surprisingly recent times. But Flores is an island, and islands change mammals. Large animals shrink. Small animals grow. Isolation turns ordinary evolutionary pressures into something more extreme. A mainland European version of that same story would be far harder to explain because southern France is not Flores. It is connected to the rest of Europe, connected to rivers, forests, valleys, animals, and other human groups. So if this body is real, adult, and truly lacking Neanderthal traits, then the simplest explanation is not that Europe had an island dwarf. The deeper problem is that Europe had diversity we have not fully accounted for. Now consider the setting. The Rhone Valley and its surrounding limestone caves form one of the great corridors of Western Eurasia. Animals moved through it, climates shifted through it, and human groups came and went through it. This is not a marginal place. It is a crossroads, and that makes the idea of a hidden population even more interesting. A deep cave layer predating glaciation points toward a warm interval before a colder phase, a time when forests expanded, rivers ran through wooded valleys, and the landscape offered many habitats within a relatively small region. In that world, a smaller-bodied human relative would not need to behave exactly like a Neanderthal. It could forage differently, range differently, shelter differently, and avoid the same ecological pressures that shaped the broad-chested, cold-adapted bodies of the classic Neanderthal line. Something is wrong with the old mental picture if every European hominin in that period is forced into one body plan, one trajectory, and one destiny. The old consensus is comfortable because it is simple. Europe, by roughly 400,000 years ago, is usually treated as a Neanderthal-making machine. The fossils from places like Cima de los Huesos in Spain already show many traits that point toward the Neanderthal condition. Strong faces, large teeth, powerful bodies, and a population moving down a path that later becomes unmistakable. In that view, Western Europe is dominated by robust archaic humans, while small, primitive-looking forms belong far away in time or far away in geography. Homo habilis belongs to earlier Africa. Homo naledi belongs to southern Africa. Homo floresiensis belongs to island Southeast Asia. Europe gets the big-bodied hunters. Europe gets the Neanderthal story. Europe gets continuity from older archaic humans into classic Neanderthals. That structure is tidy, but prehistory is rarely tidy. The contradiction begins with the size. An adult that looks like a 7-year-old child is not merely a short adult. a small modern person still carries adult proportions, adult limb relationships, adult shoulder form, adult pelvis form, and adult dental development. A true 7-year-old appearance implies something deeper. It implies that growth, body shape, and development are central to the mystery. To know what this creature is, the decisive questions are not only height and age. The decisive questions are whether the growth plates were fused, whether the wisdom teeth had erupted or were forming in an adult pattern, whether the pelvis belonged to a mature individual, whether the limb bones had adult cortical thickness, whether the skull base had finished its developmental sequence, and whether the teeth showed adult wear. If all of those signals point to adulthood, then this is not a child. It is an adult whose species, population, or developmental pathway produced a child-sized body. That matters because Homo floresiensis, Homo naledi, and Homo ergaster grade humans each offer a different answer. Homo floresiensis gives us the strongest visual analogy because it is famous, small, and unexpected. It had a tiny brain, small stature, long arms relative to body size, primitive wrist traits, and a body plan that looked like it had branched away from the main human line far earlier than expected. But Flores also carries the island problem. A Flores-like creature in France would force an extraordinary explanation. Either a very ancient lineage spread widely across Eurasia and survived in pockets for hundreds of thousands of years, or a mainland population independently evolved a similar small body through forest isolation, low resources, and long-term reproductive isolation. The first explanation is sweeping. The second is plausible in principle, but demands strong anatomical proof. A small adult in a French cave is not automatically Homo floresiensis. It is only Hobbit-like in the broad sense that it suggests small adult size and a lineage outside the expected Neanderthal pattern. Homo naledi is a more interesting comparison than it first appears. Naledi lived in southern Africa much later than anyone expected for such a primitive-looking creature, roughly in the same broad era as early Homo sapiens. Its brain was small, its body modest, its shoulders and trunk had ancient features, yet its hands, feet, and some aspects of its dentition were not simply ape-like. It was a mosaic, and that word matters because a European small-bodied hominin would almost certainly be a mosaic too. If the French cave body had primitive shoulders, a small brain, curved fingers, or unusual limb proportions, yet had teeth that looked less archaic or a foot that handled upright walking well, then Homo naledi becomes a powerful comparison. Not because the French creature would literally be Homo naledi, but because naledi proves that small-brained, small-bodied human relatives survived late in continental settings beside more advanced human populations. That fact alone breaks the assumption that every late surviving archaic population had to be large, cold-adapted, and Neanderthal-like. Then there is the Ergaster grade possibility, which in some ways makes the most sense. Homo ergaster and the early Eurasian populations often grouped near Homo erectus carried a taller and more human-like body plan than Homo habilis, but they also launched the great early dispersal out of Africa. By around 1.8 million years ago, human relatives were already at Dmanisi in the Caucasus, with small brains, small bodies, and surprisingly variable anatomy. Those individuals were not giants. They were not Neanderthals in waiting. They were early travelers, adaptable, tough, and anatomically diverse. If descendants of such populations spread westward and then became isolated in European forests, it is not impossible that one branch retained a smaller body and ancient anatomy, while another branch, through different pressures, contributed to the robust European line. In any case, an Ergaster-grade relic in Europe is less extreme than a literal Flores-like island dwarf appearing on the continent. It begins with a known Eurasian dispersal, and then asks whether one lineage survived in a concealed ecological pocket. The strongest version of that argument depends on forests. Dense forests are not just background scenery. They alter movement, diet, visibility, ranging distance, and social contact. A small-bodied human relative in a thick woodland gains certain advantages. It needs fewer calories. It can move through tighter vegetation. It can exploit smaller animals, plants, nuts, roots, insects, eggs, and seasonal foods that matter less in the grand image of Ice Age hunters chasing horses across open plains. A larger pre-Neanderthal body offers strength, cold tolerance and power, but it also demands fuel. When climates are warm and forests cover the valley, small size becomes less absurd. It becomes an adaptation. The European hobbit idea becomes strongest when it is not imagined as a lost island dwarf, but as a forest relic, a population shaped by woodland isolation inside a continent that was never as uniform as our diagrams make it appear. Still, there is a hard problem. Europe was not empty. By 400,000 years ago, the Neanderthal direction was already strong in Western Eurasia. Large-bodied archaic humans occupied caves, processed animals, made stone tools, and passed through the same corridors. A small-bodied lineage would need some kind of buffer. That buffer could be ecological, with different foods and different terrain. It could be geographic, with cave systems and forest pockets acting like islands inside the mainland. It could be behavioral, with smaller groups avoiding direct contact. It could be demographic, with small populations surviving for long stretches and then disappearing without leaving many bones. The fossil archive is not a census. It is a damaged selective sample of deaths, deposits, erosion, discovery and interpretation. If a population was rare, forest-dwelling and lightly built, it would be nearly invisible unless a cave sealed the right body in the right layer. The phrase, "there are no Neanderthal features," is the most provocative part of the quote, but it is also the part that demands the most caution. Neanderthal features are not one single thing. They include cranial shape, brow form, midface projection, occipital form, dental traits, jaw structure, inner ear anatomy, pelvis form, limb proportions, and many small details across the skeleton. A body can lack classic Neanderthal features in one region and still belong to a population near the Neanderthal stem. Juveniles also complicate the issue because immature individuals show traits differently, and a tiny adult with unusual growth could blur the pattern further. That is why the most sensible interpretation is not to leap straight to a named species. The most sensible interpretation is that the body, if correctly described, belongs to a non-classic European hominin population whose exact placement depends on anatomy that has not yet been shown. Teeth would be crucial. Teeth are often the last witnesses left when skulls and skeletons break apart, and they carry taxonomic information in crown shape, root form, enamel thickness, taurodontism, cusp pattern and wear. Neanderthals often show distinctive dental patterns, including enlarged anterior teeth and molars with internal structures that can be diagnostic. Homo floresiensis has its own unusual dental combination. Homo naledi has teeth that look surprisingly small and partly derived in some respects despite the primitive body. An Ergaster grade population would bring a different expectation again, with a more ancient dental architecture, but not necessarily Neanderthal specialization. If the French cave body has adult teeth that are small, simple and lacking classic Neanderthal internal structure, that would strongly favor a distinct lineage. If the teeth are instead within the range of early European pre-Neanderthals, then the mystery becomes a strange body size within a known population, rather than a new branch. The pelvis and legs would matter just as much. A Flores-like body would be expected to show primitive lower limb proportions, small stature, and perhaps a gait that differs subtly from later humans. A Naledi-like body would show a surprising mix, shoulders and trunk with older traits, but feet that are quite effective for walking. An Ergaster-grade relic would likely have a more familiar upright walking pattern, though with primitive proportions and smaller size. A true dwarfing syndrome in a known human population would show another pattern entirely, with pathological signs rather than a coherent population anatomy. That is the dividing line. One unusual skeleton can be pathology. Several bodies with the same pattern become population biology. This is why the mention of more bodies is so important. One body is a mystery. Several bodies are a population. Several adult bodies with the same small proportions and the same absence of Neanderthal traits would force a new chapter. What makes the most sense then, given what is known? The Flores comparison is powerful as a hook, but weak as a literal classification. Homo floresiensis is an island lineage from Southeast Asia with a deep and unusual evolutionary story. To place that exact kind of creature in France requires too many unsupported steps. The Naledi comparison is stronger as a model of survival. It proves that small-bodied, small-brained, mosaic human relatives persisted late on a continent. Yet Homo naledi itself is African, and connecting it directly to Europe requires evidence that is not available. The Ergaster grade or early Eurasian relic model is the most balanced explanation. It begins with known early dispersals into Eurasia, accepts that early populations were diverse, and allows some lineages to persist in refugia while others evolved toward Neanderthals. It also fits the idea of a forest-isolated population without needing an island. In plain terms, the best working model is not a literal Flores hobbit in Europe, but a small-bodied continental relic, perhaps descended from an early Eurasian branch closer to the habilis Ergaster world than to classic Neanderthals. This is where the story becomes larger than one cave. Middle Pleistocene Europe is often told as a straight corridor from archaic humans to Neanderthals, but the actual record keeps resisting straight lines. Cima de los Huesos shows one kind of population. Arago shows another set of robust archaic features. Grotto Mandrin later shows alternating occupations by Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. Thorin, from the same broad world of Slimak's work, revealed deep isolation inside late Neanderthal Europe itself. If Neanderthals could contain hidden lineages, then earlier Europe could contain deeper splits too. The continent was not a single breeding mass. It was a shifting landscape of valleys, cold phases, warm phases, forests, steppe, rivers, caves, and small groups that could disappear from one region while surviving in another. In that frame, the European hobbit is not an absurdity. It is a stress test for our assumptions. We assume that small archaic forms vanished early because the fossil record gives us larger, later bodies. We assume Europe became increasingly Neanderthal because the best-known fossils point that way. We assume dense forests were marginal to the main human story because stone tools and animal bones are easier to see in certain kinds of sites. But a small adult body in a deep cave cuts across all of that. It asks whether a hidden population lived in the spaces between the better-known worlds. It asks whether our species tree in Europe had a low branch, shaded by forest, that was pruned away before it could be recognized. It asks whether the Neanderthal story, already complicated by genetic isolation and late encounters with Homo sapiens, sits on top of an even older diversity. Of course, the hard truth is that a quote is not a skeleton. A statement is not a measurement. A rumour, even from an important archaeologist, is not a formal anatomical description. The decisive evidence still has to come from bone, tooth, sediment, dating, and comparison. The adult status must be proven. The layer must be securely dated. The absence of Neanderthal traits must be defined trait by trait. The body must be compared against juveniles, pathological adults, early European fossils, Dmanisi, Homo naledi, Homo floresiensis, Homo habilis, and Homo erectus. Ancient protein or genetic material would transform the whole question, though deep time and cave chemistry often destroy such traces. Until then, the correct stance is controlled tension. Not disbelief, not certainty, but attention. Indeed, what makes the claim so compelling is not that it gives us an answer. It does the opposite. It exposes a blank space. If the body is a pathological member of a known pre-Neanderthal population, that is still important because it reveals developmental variation in a period where every skeleton matters. If it is a small-bodied Neanderthal relative lacking the classic traits, it broadens the Neanderthal stem. If it is an early Eurasian relic, it changes the human map of Europe. If it is a Naledi-like continental survivor, it tells us that archaic diversity lasted far longer and spread far wider than expected. And if several bodies appear with the same anatomy, then the question stops being whether one strange individual existed and becomes whether Europe sheltered a lost human population in plain sight. In any case, the most believable picture is a creature that was not quite the Hobbit of Flores, and not quite Homo naledi, but something that makes both of them relevant. A small adult, possibly forest-adapted, possibly descended from an old Eurasian branch, living in a warm interval before the return of harsher climates, in a region where caves preserve what open landscapes erase. It would have shared Europe with larger humans moving along a different evolutionary path. It would have occupied a world of animals, stone, wood, fire, darkness, and seasonal uncertainty. It would not have known it was a relic. It would not have known that future humans would struggle to place it on a chart. It simply lived inside its own world, and then disappeared into the cave floor. And that is the real power of the European Hobbit idea. It forces us to imagine Europe not as a clean sequence, but as a crowded and uneven landscape of human experiments. Some became famous. Some became ancestors. Some became side branches. Some were known only by teeth. Some vanished before their names existed. Somewhere in that darkness, beneath layers older than glaciation, there is allegedly a body that looks like a child but is not a child, a body that carries an adult life in a form we did not expect. If that description holds, then the question is not only what it was. The question is, how many other human stories have been flattened into the word Neanderthal, simply because we had not yet found the bones that complicate the picture? Thank you for watching. If this mystery tells us anything, it is that human origin still has locked doors, and sometimes the smallest body in the deepest cave is the one that forces the largest question. What else lived beside us, before us, and almost within reach of memory, only to vanish before the world ever learned its name?